Alrighty, why don't we kick off? Welcome, everybody. Would somebody open us in prayer, please? We'll get started. Volunteers, anybody?
Sure, I'll do it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Heavenly Father, we do again thank you for this day that we can set aside to worship you and right now to look into your word and to understand how to look into your word. And thank you again for Dom teaching. We thank you that you brought us here because we're serious about our faith, and we just pray that you bless us and that we be a blessing to you today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. So I wanted to just start by trying to keep us rooted in like the bigger picture, the big thing in view, so we don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. So first week we talked about hermeneutics, what it was. I defined it as the study of integrated human interpretation. And we talked about some of the reasons why to study hermeneutics, that interpretation is both necessary and universal. So because of that, because we don't have a choice but to interpret, we would do well to study it. We talked about another reason is just because there are obstacles to interpretation and there are extremes as far as the views concerning interpretation. On one hand, it can be really positivistic, sort of overly optimistic in what's available to us as we interpret, or overly pessimistic. People can kind of despair that interpretation or access to meaning or truth or reality is available at all. And then we talked about the background, kind of the worldview background that put us where we are in the current moment, which started with Descartes in true form, his kind of rationalist epistemology, which was assuming that, basically reducing human beings to this thinking reasoner that was the one in undoubtable or indubitable thing that he could rest his whole philosophy on. Was he knew that he existed because he was thinking, and tried to build a philosophical system out from that. So he was very skeptical of anything that he couldn't have this utter, complete, almost like mathematical certainty about. And it resulted in a what we call like an objectivist approach to interpreting the world. So I, as subject, interpret and analyze these other objects that are outside of me, but it doesn't really have room for our embodied nature as human beings, our relational nature as human beings, the sort of intersubjective nature of communication and relationships. So that was Descartes. That was week one. And we talked about how modern hermeneutics was in large part a reaction against that kind of thinking about the world, that they recognized that it was more complex than that our embodiedness, our relationality was more central to our interpreting and our ability to make sense of the world than Descartes kind of allowed for. So last week, we opened this way of looking at things through what Kevin Van Hooser calls the three phases of criticism. He talked about the age of the author, the age of the text, and the age of the reader. And basically, those three things, authors, texts, and readers, meaning is connected to those things in different ways. And so as we're talking about interpretation, it makes sense to spend time like, what is the author's relationship to meaning? Is meaning tied to what an author intends or not? Today, we're going to get into texts. But as far as authors were concerned, we argued that, yes, authorial intent does matter for meaning. However, we also said that it was not helpful to think of intent as something that was like, floating off in the ether of the author's mind, because we can't access that. We can't access an author's psychology. What we can access is what the author has done in the real world with what we called speech acts. So we talked about speech act theory and the fact that when an author intends something as an action, puts words together in an intentional way, that is something that's out in public, that can be publicly evaluated. It operates according to sort of socially agreed upon conventions of language and stuff like that. And therefore, that is something that we can access. It's not buried in the author's mind, but it's available to us. And so there is a more robust way to think about authorial intent and intentionality in the speech act theory stuff. So we talked about historical situatedness, how just utterly important our nature as historical beings is for all understanding of interpretation. We cannot transcend our historical situatedness and sort of like look down on it from above, but we have to recognize that like all of us are in time, and that being in time is absolutely central to all of our understanding, meaning, communication, etc. We also talked about thinking about, as soon as you talk about authors, what they're doing with their texts as a form of communication, that really helps us to keep the author's meaning as central. If we're not thinking about it as communication, that the author means to do something, means to communicate, to be in relationship through what they do with their texts, it's a little bit easier to sort of detach it from the author and play with it more playfully and not really care what the author says. But if the author is doing something intentional to communicate, then to love our neighbor, the author, is to respect what they have done in that act of communication. We should, there's an ethics of interpretation that we should take what the author intends seriously as we interpret. So I think that's an important part of a good hermeneutic, and it keeps authorial intent centered, I think, where it should be, and it introduces the ethical dimensions of it. We talked about also anachronism, which is interpreting something kind of in the wrong historical period, and briefly talked about something called the redemptive movement hermeneutic. Okay, so where we're going this week, we're going to focus on texts themselves, so the age of the text, and things that are characteristic of, once we kind of move away from the author and look at texts themselves, what's involved there? How is meaning connected to texts? In some respects, independently of the author. And some of the guidelines that we can follow for good hermeneutics there. After this week, we're going to spend 4 weeks on the age of the reader, because interpretation is something readers do. It's not something authors do so much. It's not what texts are doing, but it's the readers who are doing the interpreting. So as we're studying hermeneutics, there's a lot to talk about as far as what we are doing as we engage with a text, and again, how meaning is related to that whole process of interpretation. And then the last 3 weeks are going to be on kind of pulling some of these things together and giving us hopefully a good model of hermeneutics under the heading of hermeneutic of faith, hope, and love. So that's kind of where we've been. That's where we're going. So today we're focused on texts. So what we're talking about today it has the most overlap with the kind of field of exegesis. So when you're talking about what we do as we try to get to the, what a text meant in its own period, what we're doing is we sit down with a Bible passage and study it well. A lot of what we're talking about today, you would cover in a good exegesis class, just so that you guys know. Okay, so the age of the text, what happened in this, sort of in the chronology of all of this, what essentially happened is, as author-centered sort of interpretation started to be challenged by certain people, we entered a phase where there's a kind of pessimism about how much some people, we talked about this last time, but they call it the intentional fallacy or the genetic fallacy, which I don't think is actually a fallacy, but basically people who disagreed that meaning was tied to authorial intent referred to that concept as a kind of fallacy, genetic fallacy, an intentionalistic fallacy. So as people started to raise those allegations, what happened was the focus almost shifted from trying to get behind the text to sources to authors to just focusing on, like, okay, what do we have in front of us? And how is meaning connected to this thing, this artifact that we have in front of us that we can study? So if we have real reservations about being able to make sense of what sources lie behind this text, can we look at it as its own sort of independent unit and make sense of meaning that's there? So that's what we call the age of the text. And so subtitle is just that texts are vehicles of communication. Again, I'm always assuming that a text was written for a reason, that there was some communicative intent behind it being written. And so even if we don't have access to an author for one reason or another, the text itself is also an act of communication that we should respect in a similar way. Okay, so as we're going to move through today, we're going to look at this form of criticism called structuralism. Then we're going to talk about the importance of genre in interpreting text and in meaning and how it's connected to texts, the importance of context, and then we'll look at the fallacies of proof texting and illegitimate totality transfer. I guess like those kind of ridiculous kind of names. Structuralism. So my hermeneutics professor, Ian Proven, wrote up his biblical hermeneutics text, and he's got a good succinct summary of structuralism in there. He says that it's the idea that there are deep structures of thought in all literature, and these structures transcend individual authors and determine their writing. We'll be getting into what he means by that, what they mean by that. Structuralists believe, he continues, that irrespective of any particular author's conscious intentions, there exist universally recurring features in the literature of all cultures and ages, and it is these that reveal any particular text's most fundamental meaning. So texts, ways of writing, ways of communicating have a kind of deep structure to them that authors are essentially working with those deep structures as they communicate. They're not making up communication out of whole cloth. They're working with what they have. Language would be an obvious example of that. I don't make up language. I deal with the language that I have and the structures that kind of make it up. So there are three really important figures in this sort of structuralist movement who are really influential. Ferdinand de Saussure, Vladimir Propp, and Daniel Pat. Okay, so Ferdinand de Saussure, he's a linguist who lived from 1857 to 1913. Basically, his main idea is that language should be thought of as a complete system at any given instant in time. So thinking of it as something that trying to think of language over the course of time mistakes what is happening with that language at any given moment. Okay. In other words, like our English language and the conventions that we have right now, like there's a way that the English language works in this instant. And yes, it worked differently. We used these and nows a long time ago, but that sort of history isn't going to affect what I'm saying right now and what I mean right now. So he says we should think about language like in the current moment that it is written in. Kind of with that in mind, there are two aspects of language that he talked about. He referred to them as langue and parole. Langue is just the French word for language. And essentially what langue is the broad set of rules that determine how a language is used. Okay, it's the conventions, it's the grammar, it's the syntax, all that stuff is like langue. And so there's an infinite potential for, communicative acts in the system of langue. Okay, so langue is like the system of rules that we're working in. It's not talking about a specific act of speech, but rather like that whole system through which acts of speech can be spoken. Parole is, on the other hand, when we take those rules and we apply them to a specific speech act. So I say something in English, and once I've taken those rules and I've done something concrete with them, that's parole. That's my speech act, like we talked about last time. Okay, and so thinking about language as both this system and then independent acts within that system, that's Saussure's concepts of langue and parole. And this does come up a lot in the kind of hermeneutics literature, that framework. Okay, so an illustration that's often given is like chess. Okay, so langue is like the rules of chess. Parole would be like a specific move. Okay, so we make a specific move out of that larger system of rules that we're working with. Does that make sense? So, so he sees languages and communication as kind of constrained by those structures. So that set of rules that make up langue, it also constrains how we are able to speak, because we have to operate by those rules. And so those structures themselves, he thought, carried with them the ability to kind of contain, to bear a kind of meaning. So the way that our rules are structured is capable of, there's like meaning rooted in that almost. That was Saussure's kind of contention. Okay, so that's Saussure, langue and parole. Vladimir Propp studied Russian folk tales. Like he looked at about 100 different folk tales. And again, he was looking for a kind of deep structure. So folk tales can take obviously you've got a whole bunch of different forms, right? A bunch of different independent tales. But he says you can boil those down to some basic structures. They follow the same patterns. They follow the same rules. And again, you can tell a whole bunch of different kind of folk tales, but by sort of following those patterns, the meaning of those folk tales is rooted in that more basic structure that you're working with. Okay, so again, there's authorial intent has a place, but also by virtue of working with those deep structures, there's a meaning almost embedded in what we are communicating as well. He says, so again, Ian Proven says, there are patterns to storytelling, and folktales in their individuality nevertheless reflect these patterns. They follow basic structures. Therefore, we know how stories should go, right? We know, for example, that although the three little pigs in one ancient children's story are not the three little bears who discover Goldilocks' home invasion in another, yet nevertheless, the climactic moments in both stories will be found in the third case. That's what we expect. This rule of three is a marked feature of ancient storytelling, a structural feature of such storytelling, underlying all sorts of narratives that are very different from each other in their individual detail, okay? So if somebody's telling the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, she goes in, she lies down, and the first bed was too hard. And so she gets up, she goes to the second bed. It was soft, and she fell asleep, slept the whole night, and then went home afterwards. You'd be like, wait, no, that's not how the story's supposed to go. And we know it, right? Because it's not following those structures, it's not following those patterns. I do want to read this because I think it's funny. So Robert Farrar Capon is this. He was a Christian writer who wrote about all sorts of stuff. He's very enjoyable to read, and he kind of explains this concept of structuralism in a book called The Third Peacock from the Left. And this is what Ian kind of summarized this for it. He says, all right, in this story, we encounter a princess who's under a curse and has fallen asleep. She can be awakened only with an apple from the tree in the middle of the garden at the western end of the world. Capon imagines how a king well-trained in logistics might approach a problem of acquiring this apple. He would get out his maps, brief his generals, and send a couple of well-supplied divisions to the garden to fetch the apple. It would be a simple matter, and success would be guaranteed. But everyone knows, of course, that this is not the way the story goes. The only suitable candidate for the quest turns out to be the miller's third son. He sets off for the garden with strict instructions about what he must and must not do. Quote, after entering the garden, go straight to the tree, pick the apple, and get out. Do not, under any circumstances, engage in conversation with a third peacock on the left. Okay, Capon continues as follows. Any child worth his root beer can write the rest of the story for you. The boy goes into the garden and gets as far as the third peacock on the left, who asks him whether or not he wouldn't like a stein of the local root beer. Before he knows it, he has had three and falls fast asleep. When he wakes up, he's in a pitch black cave. A light flickers, a voice calls, and from there, all hell breaks loose. The boy follows an invisible guide wearing a cocked hat and descends into the bowels of the earth. He rows down rivers of fire in an aluminum diggy, is imprisoned by the crown prince of the salamanders, is finally rescued by a confused eagle who deposits him at the eastern end of the world, works his way back to the western end in the dead of winter, gets the apple, brings it home, touches it to the princess' lips, arouses her, reveals himself as the long-lost son of the Eagle King, and marries the princess. Then, and only then, do they live happily ever after, okay? So that's just kind of like a silly example of how just like these stories work a certain way, and we know how they work a certain way. The king's not going to send his military, mission accomplished, okay, go home. It's like they follow these patterns, and we know when these patterns have been broken. So that's kind of the assumption that structuralists are operating under is like there's meaning embedded in those patterns, okay? And that's in some respects it's independent from authorial intent. Okay, then Daniel Pat, basically he applied the various elements of the structuralist perspective to biblical exegesis. He was looking for underlying linguistic, narrative, mythological structures in the biblical text and how those might give us sort of access to some level of meaning that was contained in them. Okay, so again, kind of appealing to Ian here, we can think of the deep structures in narratives and language. That's something that authors just have to work with. They have to work with what they're given. He says, the structures are simply inevitably there. Since an author in his speech or his parole cannot but use the langue available to him. And so they're looking for meaning that's embedded in stuff like linguistic conventions, literary, and narrative structure. One area, just for me personally, that this has, I think, been applicable is most of you probably know kind of what chiasm is. It's this way of communicating where you kind of work your way into a central claim with a series of statements, and then you work your way back out in a kind of mirror image of the way that you went in. And so in a chiasm, the sort of the central claim, what's being taught is kind of the middle thing, what's in the middle of the X, in the middle of the chi. And so there are plenty of cases in the Bible where there's like a real obvious chiasm. It's undeniably there. It's crystal clear. And then there's this whole like spectrum where it's like there's a good case for it to be there, and then there's other ones where it's just like people claim that there's a chiasm. It's like, really, is that really there, or are you just kind of imposing your own ideas on the text? So I think that there's something to be said for the idea that like thinking in that way, working way to a central claim and then back out again, that is a kind of structure, right? That is a kind of way of thinking. And I think it's possible that authors just sort of worked with that way of, that's how they thought about the world. And like, I go into a central claim, then I work my way back out again. And so you can see how Paul or somebody might have that kind of a structure in their paragraph without having thought like, oh yeah, I'm going to have A and A prime and B and B prime. And it's like really being specific and technical about it. But it's just like by virtue of being the way that they thought, they kind of followed that structure. And so we might have good reason to say, well, there's this central claim and it seems to be in this sort of chiastic structure. So maybe that we should look into whether maybe this is kind of the main gist of what the author wants to get at with this paragraph. So that I think is a way that structuralism might have some insights in how we approach meaning, right? Because if that's true, then the author's meaning will be located at that central point. So we'll be assisted in our interpretation by kind of recognizing that and looking into those things. All right. Yeah, and then similarly, basically, when you do kind of comparative studies of like ancient Near Eastern literature and the literature of the societies around them, a lot of times there are these real striking patterns. And those authors are all working with a kind of, in some respects, a shared worldview. And so when we will be helped in our interpretation by familiarizing ourselves with the kind of patterns, the narrative patterns and structures that they were working with, because that's how they were communicating meaning. They weren't communicating like the Genesis and Exodus weren't written to us right now. First and foremost, they were written to their own audiences who, again, were working with these structures, these ways of thinking. So the better we understand those, the better a chance we have at getting at what Genesis or whatever is actually communicating. Okay, so let's shift to genre. That's kind of some of the big ideas of structuralism, how it all works.
Hey, Dom.
Yes.
I have a question back on the structure thing.
Yeah.
When they're talking about those structures, are they saying that there's like one universal structure, or was there like the ancient writers would have had a certain structure? Once we figure it out, then we can do it, versus a structure we might have now, or?
I don't think they'll go quite as far as saying like there's this one universal structure, which if we can tap into that, like we can read, it is more, like more localized. Okay. And so,
time period.
Yeah, time period. But again, those things kind of like stretch out, right? As we inherit from the time periods before us. So, so Ian, let me see if I can find a quote real quick. It said something like, there's only so many ways. Yeah, he says, sometimes extra biblical literature reflects and addresses such important questions. He's talking about these big questions, God, what it mean to be human, all that stuff. He says, extra biblical literature reflects and addresses such important questions in strikingly similar ways to the Bible, just because it seems there are only so many stories that can be told and only so many different kinds of characters performing their important functions who can inhabit them, right? So you do see like watch films, right? How often is it the same storyline? That like there to some degree, it does seem like we're limited, right? In the kinds of stories we can tell. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so genre. Genre is huge for the meaning of a text. It is absolutely vital to understand the genre that a text is written in if we're going to understand its meaning. Okay, so last time we talked about speech acts, and that the locutionary speech act was what an author did with a particular set of words, with propositional content, right? So you have the propositional content of Jesus feeding 5,000. An author can do certain things with that content. He can make it an assertion, Jesus fed 5,000. He can make it a question, did Jesus feed 5,000? So what we do with that content is what was referred to as the locutionary speech act. Genre can be thought of in a similar way, okay? Genre is a way of doing something with words. It's a way of doing something with concepts, a set of patterns and sort of symbolic universe. It's how it's a form of communication. That's what genre is. It is the shape or form that a text is given to make that text do a certain thing or communicate in a certain way. Okay, so Van Hooser says that narratives, for instance, enable us to experience and reflect on the temporal connectedness of human existence and personal identity, unlike any other forms of literature or thinking. Okay, narratives are able to talk about how we're temporally located and the flow of time and how that changes our identity and stuff, right? In this respect, a genre is like a descriptive framework that allows certain aspects of reality to shine through more than others. That's what genre does, is by taking a certain form, it allows certain aspects of reality to shine through. And so you use different genres to communicate, to basically give us insights into different aspects of reality. So a poem and a narrative are generally going to communicate truth in very different ways by how they highlight different aspects of reality. He gives the example of different kinds of maps, right? Topographical map is different than a map that gives you like political boundaries, right? They're both maps of the same area, but they are just doing different things. They're focusing on different aspects of that reality. So these different maps, each map highlights certain features of the world more than others and accomplishes different tasks. Informing, warning, encouraging, commanding, assuring. And so genres are a form of writing and a way of thinking that do things. So again, I think that to some degree, genres communicate irreducibly. So will inevitably be something lost in translation. But a genre's ability to shed light on that specific aspect of reality makes it so that another genre which can't do it in that same way, like you can't just translate from one genre to another. Like will be something lost, right? So for instance, like think of the genre of fantasy, right? In the Chronicles of Narnia, Jesus is depicted as this majestic lion. There's a witch, there's talking animals, there's magic in general, as well as this deep magic. So think of how much of a mistake it would be to suggest that these elements can somehow just like, that these elements take away from what Lewis is doing, right? He's communicating in a genre. There aren't witches, there aren't talking animals, but by virtue of him communicating through the genre of fantasy, it doesn't make it like less true. It's just that it's a way of getting at truth. It's a way of getting at reality that is available in fantasy, just because of just this irreducible thing that the genre brings to the table. It provides genuine insight into truth and reality in a way that only fantasy can, I would suggest. And I would challenge anybody to try and replicate The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a systematic theology on the atonement. Like, I dare you. You can't do it. You'll lose something if you try and do that. Okay, so Van Hooser writes that what relation a sentence bears to external reality depends on the kind of literary act being performed. So history and fiction both aspire to truth, to correspondence to the world, but in different ways and under different descriptive frameworks. I think Lewis believed this as well. And I don't want to take too much time on this, but I think it's worth looking at some of what he said about it. He talks about being a child and being in church and the resistance to the teaching to certain ideas that he had just by virtue of the fact that there was on like this big stained glass building. He says, why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought I could. Okay, so that's why he wrote on it. He wanted to help us to feel what the atonement communicated in a way that just reading, a treatise on the atonement just cannot do. He wrote that the genre of fantasy and myth had the power to generalize while remaining concrete, to present in palpable form, not concepts or even experiences, but whole classes of experience, and to throw off irrelevancies. Okay, so hermeneutics is about interpretation. It's about making sense of what texts mean, and genre is just critical to that. Authors chose genre for a reason. Yes, Sarah?
Are you going to talk about the different genres within the Bible at some point?
So, yes and no. In a biblical hermeneutics course, that would make a lot of sense. So I was going to get to it in a minute here. Different biblical hermeneutics texts that I have, like Osborne's book, The Hermeneutical Spiral. Kaiser and Silva had this textbook, Introduction to Biblical Hermeneutics. Both of those devote a third of their books to genres, like how you read different biblical genres. Okay, this is a general hermeneutics course, so we're not going to do that. Just basically give you the idea that like that is important, that does matter. And if you're looking at the Bible with its own set of genres, you're going to need to learn how those communicate reality, right? So it makes sense to study, but just we can't do it in the scope of this thing.
Yeah, but just like generally, there's poetry, there's narrative. Can you just even
wisdom literature?
Wisdom, apocalyptic, right? Even Genesis. Like you're going to miss something in Genesis if you're not familiar with ancient Near Eastern creation myths, like the watery chaos. All these things that we read, and we only know them through the lens of Genesis. But these were concepts that were very much in play in those societies. And when the author of Genesis talks about the watery chaos in a certain way, like with a certain genre, they're communicating, they're speaking to, and in some respects against, other ancient Near Eastern creation myths because of what they believe about that watery chaos. You're going to have to learn about those genres. So that's all I can get into it, unfortunately.
Sorry, can you just restate the references for those? Because you said there were two books that you mentioned where a third of them was taken up by, so if someone wants to look further, they would.
I mean, those are just examples. So Grant Osborne has this well-known book, The Hermeneutical Spiral, where it's his biblical hermeneutics. Another textbook was the one by Kaiser and Silva. It's just an introduction to biblical hermeneutics. And another one that I didn't mention is Fee and Stewart, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. The entire thing is structured on how you look at different genres, right? So it's important. And most good biblical hermeneutics texts should spend a good amount of time looking at that stuff. Okay. I am going to skip some stuff. There's this idea of, there's a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he talked about this idea of language games, basically rules. They're like all speech acts occur according to set rules, but we have different language games that we play by. And essentially, genre can be thought of as a specific kind of language game. Depending on what kind of language game you're in, that'll determine the rules of how you interpret. And he says also that this is largely communicated through training. It's not explicitly taught, like this is how you interpret this kind of communication. Rather, we're just given that kind of communication and we learn by a kind of training, kind of just experiencing and learning how these things intend to communicate. We learn how to go about interpreting. So when we hear once upon a time, nobody told us like once upon a time is a marker of a fairy tale. Like we just learned that like I hear once upon a time, it's going to be a fairy tale. Like it occurs through training, which is another reason that like if you haven't been trained in a given genre, then there's going to be something missing. Like you're going to have to do some work to figure out like how a particular genre operated because you haven't been trained in those approaches to interpreting it correctly, right? You're not going to go, it would be a mistake to go feeling around the back of wardrobes, right? After reading Narnia. But how do you trust God when you encounter evil, right? And you don't feel his presence right there? That's something that Narnia will very much help you with. It's just a matter of how you go about interpreting it. And you can mess with genres, right? Orson Welles in World of Worlds, like he casts one kind of genre, science fiction, in another kind of genre, news radio broadcast, and people literally go running for the hills because they weren't expecting that he pulled the switch on him there, right? So genre is just absolutely huge. I'm going to leave it at that because just for the sake of time, I don't want to run out here. So context. Context is our next thing. Context. I had to choose one single thing that was the most important for all understanding of text. Context is probably it. So yeah, Michael Gorman, who has an exegesis text that I use, he says, context is so crucial to interpretation that it is no exaggeration whatsoever to say that if you alter the context of a word or sentence or paragraph, you alter the content of that text. Okay, it's really hard to overstate how important context is to our interpretation. We have to attend to the context. So Saussure, who we talked about in the structuralism thing, he distinguished between two important aspects of literary context. And again, forgive the technical terminology, but he talked about the syntagmatic context to other words. And so syntax refers to how words are ordered in a sentence. And the syntagmatic relationship of words to one another refers to their relationship in a given sentence. So for example, the sentences, the hawk attacked the dove and the dove attacked the hawk, use the same words, but they mean different things. And that it's the syntagmatic context that determines the meaning of those words. So how hawk and dove are sort of ordered with respect to each other in the sentence, okay? So that's one aspect of context. And it limits meaning, okay? We use that kind of context to limit meaning. So with those, whatever it is, 5 words or so, there's a whole bunch of possible meanings, and by putting them in a certain relation to one another, we begin to restrict the meaning that's available, right? Then there's paradigmatic relations or paradigmatic context, and that has to do with words that are more or less synonyms, like what words are similar enough to one another that we can substitute one for another in a given kind of context, okay? So for instance, using that same analogy, the words hawk and raptor are in paradigmatic relationship to one another. Dove and culver are in paradigmatic relationship to one another. We kind of substitute one for the other. Their meaning overlaps in that way, right? But hawk also can have the meaning of like a militarist, right? And dove as a pacifist. So those are also in paradigmatic relationship to one another. So got a nice slide. This media-rich class you guys are doing. Okay, so Thistleton notes that viewing context in terms of these two relations is one of the 2 defining characteristics of modern linguistics, okay? Those 2 kinds of context are 2 of the defining characteristics of modern linguistics. Okay, so like I said, syntagmatic relationships in particular have an important limiting effect to which of a word's paradigmatic relations are in view. okay? So we talked about hawk, that it can be falcon or bird or militarist. But in the sentence, the hawk flew to his nest, okay? The syntagmatic relationship between hawk, flew, and nest most likely limits what we're talking about to a kind of bird, right? To the raptor meaning of hawk. There is an important semantic principle that goes with this idea of how that context limits the meaning. And basically, so Thistleton, again, is quoting this other guy who says that semantic axiom number 1 is that the meaning of a word is such that it contributes the least to the total message derivable from the passage in which it occurs. So let me read that again. Martin Jews goes so far as to call it semantic axiom number 1, that the meaning of a word is such that it contributes least to the total message derivable from the passage in which it occurs. This is important because, so when we do biblical word studies, okay, this is something to keep in mind, because words do have a number, they have a semantic range, they have a range of meanings that they can kind of communicate, right? And context is actually what limits that range down. And if we approach a biblical text as if it's this kind of magical thing, and we say, well, what if it means this? And we take a less likely meaning, that's an exegetical mistake. We don't want to approach text like that. We don't want to approach words and word studies like that. We should always assume that the most likely meaning is the one that contributes the least to the context. Okay, so the hawk flew to his nest. That could be referring to the militarist taking an airplane home. Okay, all those, that's possible option. It's unlikely, and unless we have other good contextual meanings or contextual stuff to assign that meaning, we want to go with the most likely one, the one that contributes the least. Okay, you've got to contribute more for it to mean that than what the context allows. Okay, so Silva says that the principle of contextual interpretation is, at least in theory, one of the few universally accepted hermeneutical guidelines, even though the consistent application of the principle is notoriously difficult enterprise. Okay, he goes on and he says that context does not merely help us to understand the meaning, it virtually makes meaning. And this is an insight that James Barr had later, and he really significantly impacted this kind of direction of biblical studies with this observation, that context is by a long shot the most important. In doing like etymological studies, the history of a word and what it meant in one context or another, people were spending a lot of time on doing that kind of stuff. And for him, he called out viciously some of the biblical studies spheres that were approaching their exegesis that way. So context virtually makes meaning. A standard introduction to linguistic science informs us that among the diverse meaning a word possesses, the only one that will emerge into consciousness is the one determined by the context. All others are abolished, extinguished, non-existent. This is true even of words whose significance appears to be firmly established. In other words, even with really technical words that generally only mean one thing, context is still more important than that to account for, because they can be metaphor, the way that we use language, even really technical words can be used in a different way if the context intends for that. So this is appealing back to something that I said in the first lecture, but listen to this sentence, okay? Janelle had waited so long for the opportunity to become a shift manager, but when she learned who she would be working for if she took the position, rather than applying, she passed. When we hear that sentence, none of us is asking the question of whether we're talking about soccer here or whether we're talking about her diet, right? We talked about the sentence he passed and how many different things that can mean and how much is going on when we interpret, right? But you can see how here the context limited the meaning of such that those other meanings didn't even enter our mind. Like it's as they say here, all others are abolished, extinguished, non-existent. That's how important context is to determining meaning, okay? It is a big mistake to say, oh, she passed. That could mean she died. So maybe she was so upset by who she would have been working for that she actually died, right? That's a mistake. Unless you have, again, more context to inform that kind of interpretation, That's not how you go about doing stuff. And yet, if you watch people doing biblical exegesis, some people get a little bit crazy with their word studies, and that's almost how they treat it. Biblical words are not magic. They're operating by the same conventions that we operate by. Okay. I think I'm gonna leave that there. I do want to make one comment. This course is intended for navigators eventually. And navigators are really big on the topical memory system, which is just an approach to memorizing scripture, which is phenomenal. My only sort of, what I would say to people who are approaching biblical memorization as just taking a series of verses and memorizing them is, if you're going to do that, do try, and when you're memorizing the verse, to know what the context is, so that you're not sort of stripping it from that context. Because if we just have this list of memory verses, and we don't know how each of them applied, like again, we've talked about how important context is. Like, we should be familiar with that. I'm not saying don't memorize, but when we memorize, be familiar with the context so that you're not applying it in an illegitimate way. Okay, so that's kind of what gets us to the proof texting fallacy. Most of you guys have probably heard the term. There's this common saying that goes, a text without a context is a pretext, or a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. As Gorman puts it, a pretext is an excuse for finding one's presuppositions confirmed by the text. And he says, in consequence, many misinterpretations of the Bible are due to a neglect of the literary context. So proof texting is doing that. It's just grabbing a verse, pulling it out of its context to mean kind of whatever I want it to mean in the moment. Kaiser and Silva, in that hermeneutics text that I mentioned earlier, said, this method, insofar as it ignores context, is completely inadequate. At worst, it tends to treat the Bible as if it contained secret codes, or as an analogy of sayings for every occasion. Individual texts, however, belong to larger units and address specific situations coming out of historical purposes for which they were written, and contexts for which they now are relevant. He said the proof text model often relies on a naive reading of the text. It may disregard the purpose for which a text was written, the historical conditioning in which it is set, and the genre conventions that shaped it. He says what is forfeited in this method is any divine authority for what is taught. Okay, so I agree with that. Be careful. If meaning is tied to authorial intent, and we believe that with the Bible, there's a divine intent reflected in that. Okay, when we don't, and context is the chief way through which meaning is communicated, right? Through which meaning is distilled, is narrowed down. Then by proof texting, what we're doing is we're ignoring that intentionality. We're ignoring how that text was intended to be used, and therefore denying the divine authority behind it. So don't proof text. If you're going to appeal to a verse, please know what the context is and whether it actually applies to the thing you're talking about. It doesn't help to just throw out Bible verses. You know, if we all sort of have a common understanding of the context, sure. Like, you can use shorthand, right? But at the same time, like, things also devolve into this like Bible verse ping pong, where we're just like throwing verses because the words that we think, oh yeah, that applies to this situation. And we're not attending to the context as we apply them. So mistake. Yeah, Christian, you wanted to.
Can you give us an example, Dom, of like a Bible verse that historically Christians tend to proof text and pull out? And it's like, oh, that sounds true, and it may be sort of true, but the author really had it in this package. There are plenty. If you want me to tick off as many people as possible, as many Protestants as possible. So the whole thing about our righteousness being filthy rags, every person after like Reformed exegesis of that text says like even our best actions are but filthy rags in the sight of God, right? So there's this idea that like, which I agree with, that like you can't, good works are never enough, right? But at the same time, if you look at the context of that text, right, he's talking about people who are doing kind of these like surface works, going to the temple, they're paying their tithes or whatever, but then they're committing injustice. on the back, and their hands are soaked in blood as they then go to church and do the nice things that they're supposed to do as formalities, right? And for him, that's what he's saying. He's like, it's those good works that, yeah, like at the surface level, yeah, it looks good to go to church, but by virtue of being sort of stained, right? Filthy rags is a bodily function reference, and so there's something staining the rags, okay? And the same way, those good acts are being stained by the injustice that the people doing them are. So I don't think I've ever heard that verse interpreted that way. So like take it with a grain of salt. This is Dom's sort of like pet peeve thing, and you want to go do your own research and confirm. Maybe there are better things that I've thought of, but nonetheless, it does seem, if you take the full context of Isaiah, read the beginning of Isaiah, and then read that verse, it seems pretty clear to me that like it's that kind of hypocrisy that's in view. It's not good enough to just do the formalities and then, you know, perpetuate injustice against all the people in your land. You're like, it's the whole picture that God wants, not just the shell, but also so yeah, I think that's proof texted.
And how they often can sound nice and good, and like, yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
It's just not really what Isaiah was talking about in the context of the whole passage.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, one way that this happens a lot in our current moment is with sound bites, right? Like essentially a sound bite is a proof text in today's sort of media environment. Like you grab what somebody says, it's got the words that I'm going to assign the meaning to those words because of how I want this person to be communicating, and boom. And then the news stories get written, it gets out into the world, and nobody bothers to go back and check the context. And it's this huge threat, I think, to our society and to discourse and mutual understanding. Like, we cannot operate that way. Like context is everything. We have to pay attention to context as we interpret stuff. Twitter, it's designed for that, it seems like.
How do you feel about that?
Okay, we're very much at the end here. So I want to briefly talk about illegitimate totality transfer. That's James Barr's term. And essentially it is, we've talked about what's going on as he describes this. It's, he wrote his book, The Semantics of Biblical Language, to address what he saw as examples of putting too much weight on words alone. So you had these really famous theological dictionaries by like Kittle and stuff like that. And an entire sort of, these lengthy articles were written on different Greek and Hebrew words. And people were putting way too much weight on the words themselves and not nearly enough weight in the context. And so he wrote it to like really carpet bomb the theological dictionary of the New Testament. So he defined illegitimate totality transfer as the error that arises when the meaning of a word, understood as the total series of relations in which it is used in the literature, is read into a particular case as its sense and implication there. In other words, words are, again, broad semantic range, okay? That full semantic range is not available in every unique instance of that word. We've talked about how it's context that narrows down meanings. So you can't just say, here's this word in this Bible verse. I'm going to look it up in the theological dictionary, and I'm going to pick the meaning that I like as the one that it means here. That's not how language works. So illegitimate totality transfer is transferring the total possible meanings of that word into a specific usage of it. Okay. Again, that's an exegetical fallacy. We really can't approach the Bible that way. As Moises Silva puts it in his own book on this, he says, it's intended to stress the simple fact that that any one instance of a word will not bear all the meanings possible for that word. Okay. So parole and log. Okay. A specific instance of parole doesn't contain with it all the possible meanings in log. Okay. The speech act itself determines meaning. It narrows down meaning. Barr just thought the door was left way too wide open for, what words could mean. Okay. So we avoid the hermeneutical error of illegitimate totality transfer when we recognize that context is what ultimately determines meaning. We should not assume that words, especially theological words, can bear any other possible meanings in a given context. Words simply can't carry that much weight. It's the way that a word's used in context that should be our primary source for the meaning of that word. Okay, any questions? That's more or less the end here. Yeah, Josh.
Just one thing that I was noticing. Sometimes words do carry more than one meaning at once. Like Paul sometimes uses puns and things like that.
Yeah.
And that can really confuse you because then if you're just looking for the plainest meaning, you might actually miss that he's playing with his words at the same time.
Yeah, and so they call it. There are different terms for that. Polysemy or is one of them. There are different like terminology that they use to express that. Irony, right? Double entendre is a thing, but even there, like while that's true, and like somebody like John is much more likely to have like to play like with multiple meanings of a word as he writes stuff than I think typically Paul or others, and that's something you can pay attention to. But it's going to be the same principles apply in that context will still provide the kind of the boundaries, right? The blocks for what of those multiple meanings is available. It's that sort of next step of complexity. But yes, that's a good point. And we don't want to artificially restrict the freedom of authors to create artistic, stuff, and that is part of it. So yeah, thank you. Myself.
Yeah, I just wanted to share with everybody, there's a really easily accessed tool you can use, which is called the Bible Project. And they have great little videos on every book of the Bible that kind of give you the overall idea and concept and structure. And I find it really helpful before I read to watch that video again and again and again and again before it kind of gets you in the right.
The Bible Project?
The Bible Project.
Yeah, they're great. And the Bible Project, I would locate kind of in this sphere, in the realm of the age of the text, because they don't tend to do a lot of like the historical background stuff. They tend to focus a lot more on design patterns and narrative structure and these sort of symbols that sort of flow through the biblical stuff. So they certainly would not look like they don't look like some of the drier stuff that you would have had 50, 100 years ago, where it was all about sources and stuff like that. And while I think sources matter, authors do matter, and their meaning is an important aspect of interpretation. There's a lot to be gained when you focus on the text and you say, okay, what like just if I focus here on the artistry that's represented here, on the structures, the narrative sort of currents of it, there's a lot to be learned just by that. So, okay, I should stop because it's 9:30. And people have to go get kiddos. Can somebody close us really quickly in prayer? Just to finish this off, please.
Father, I want to thank you for this morning, and thank you for Dom and all the work that he's done. And Lord, I just ask that you would be with each one of us as we go throughout our week, that we would be able to take the things that we're learning here and then apply them to our lives as we read your word, and that through putting in a little extra work, we might get to know you better. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.